Imagine, for just a minute, that you wake up tomorrow morning, you go to make your coffee, you look at your life, and you suddenly discover that the fundamental story of who you are has been entirely erased.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a terrifying thought.
Right. I mean, I'm talking about your family tree, your medical history, the genetic traits you see in the mirror, the very name you were given on the day you were born, just gone.
Completely wiped out.
Exactly. And the truly terrifying part isn't that this information was lost in some, tragic, unavoidable accident. It was actively rewritten by the state. You have been issued a new name, a fabricated history, and a legally mandated fiction that you are forced by law to live inside.
It is an incredibly unsettling thought experiment to place yourself in. I mean, it completely strips away the foundational trust we all implicitly place in the institutions that record our existence.
Yeah, we just take it for granted.
We do. We navigate the world assuming our identity is an absolute untouchable truth, right? Our birth certificate feels like the ultimate anchor. But what you were describing is a scenario where human identity is treated as nothing more than, well, an administrative variable.
A piece of data.
Exactly. It becomes something that can be deleted, whited out, and replaced entirely for the convenience of a system.
And if you're listening to this thinking, well, if that happened to me, I'd just go to the government, show them the truth, and get it fixed, you are really underestimating the machine.
Oh, completely.
Because what if, when you finally tried to reclaim that original identity, you weren't met with some malicious villain in a dark room who you could, defeat? What if you were met with a wall of polite, impenetrable, endlessly looping bureaucracy?
Just endless forms and transfers.
Yeah, customer service surveys, jurisdictional ping pong, dead ends.
So that is the reality we are exploring today. Our mission on this deep dive is to unpack a massive, highly detailed, and frankly, astonishing forensic research report by advocate and author Shane Boole. It's a massive piece of work.
It really is. He has mapped out what he calls the architecture of erasure within Australia's forced adoption system. He is pulling back the curtain on exactly how identity is dismantled and, more importantly, how the state reacts when a citizen tries to put those pieces back together.
So to really grasp the weight of what Boole's research uncovers, we need to establish where the public consciousness currently sits on this.
Right, the baseline.
Yeah. If you bring up forced adoption in Australia with the average person, their mind almost universally goes straight to the 2013 national apology.
Sure, yeah.
That was a highly publicized, profoundly emotional moment, right? The federal government officially recognized the historical wrongs, the pain and the trauma inflicted upon mothers and children who were forcibly separated.
Right, and it is generally viewed by the public as a closed historical chapter. We acknowledged a dark past, the Prime Minister offered a sincere apology, tears were shed in Parliament, and we all collectively agreed to move forward. The book is closed.
But the core thesis of Shane Boole's exhaustive research argues that the book is wide open and the ink is still wet.
Wow.
He presents a deeply documented case, arguing that the violence of forced adoption is not historical in the slightest. I mean, it is an ongoing, active process.
So it's happening right now.
Exactly. His findings suggest that this erasure is maintained right now, today, through modern administrative structures, through educational frameworks that intentionally omit critical trauma training, and through what he terms an installational corruption within the bureaucracy itself.
And before we get into the heavy mechanics of how this system operates, I do want to frame how we are approaching this discussion today. Boole's research is forensic, and it names names.
It certainly does.
The source material we are unpacking today contains intense documented critiques of major government departments like the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, or DUWR, as well as legislative bodies and specific political figures, including Jason Clare, Bill Shorten, Tanya Plibersek, and Robert Tickner. So our goal today is not to play judge and jury on these political critiques.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to endorse one political viewpoint over another or to validate these claims as absolute objective truth.
That distinction is vital. We are stepping into the role of analytical guides here. Our focus is purely on the mechanics of these arguments.
Just unpacking it all.
Exactly. We want to understand the profound lived experience data Boole presents, the sociological frameworks he has developed to explain them, and the documented public record responses of the institutions involved.
Right.
We're looking at how a citizen interacts with the massive machinery of the state, how trauma is defined by different systems, and how large bureaucracies protect their own hegemony.
Okay, so To understand how a massive national system allegedly fails its citizens, we can't start by looking at a sprawling organizational chart of government departments. That's just way too abstract.
Too dry.
Yeah. To understand the machinery, we have to start with the human being caught inside the gears. We have to look at the genesis of displacement.
And the research positions Shane Brule's own life as the archetypal case study for this exact phenomenon. He was born Paul Allen Morley, and his personal narrative serves as a kind of forensic map.
Okay.
It illustrates, step by step, how administrative decisions made in a government office fracture a human identity, creating a cascade of psychological, social, and biological consequences that literally last a lifetime.
And the details of his specific biological lineage contain an irony so profound you almost couldn't write it into a movie script.
You really couldn't.
Shane Boole is the biological son of Mark Moffat. Now, for anyone who follows Australian music history, Mark Moffat is the legendary producer behind the iconic Yuthu Yindi anthem, Treaty.
It is difficult to overstate the cultural magnitude of Treaty. I mean, it's not just a pop song. It is a monumental cultural artifact in Australia.
Oh, absolutely.
It is an anthem that was celebrated, promoted, and archived by the Australian state, has a profound, righteous demand for Indigenous truth-telling. It is a song about sovereignty, about the deep, unbreakable recognition of bloodlines, and about acknowledging the historical reality of what has been stolen from families.
So on one hand, you have the state publicly celebrating and commodifying a song about the absolute sanctity of preserving bloodlines and historical truth.
Yes.
And on the exact same day, in the exact same country, Boole argues that the state's very own administrative, medical, and legal apparatus was actively enforcing the systematic erasure of the producer's own son's bloodline.
It's staggering.
The state is archiving the song while simultaneously taking white out to the birth records of the man who produced it.
Boole's research refers to this staggering contradiction as an ontological and epistemological fault line of colonial psychology.
Okay, wait, that sounds like incredibly dense academic jargon.
It does, but it is actually describing a very raw, lived reality.
Break that down for me then. Ontological and epistemological fault line. Let's make that tangible for the listener.
Simply put, it describes a government suffering from a fractured reality. Ontology is the study of reality, what actually exists in the world.
Okay.
And epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what is true. So a fault line here means the state operates with two completely incompatible versions of truth.
I see.
In the public performative sphere, it embraces historical awareness and reconciliation. It champions the message of treaty. But in the private administrative sphere, it maintains a rigid, impenetrable legal framework designed to falsify vital records and hide the truth.
It's institutional hypocrisy formalized into law, because when Boole actually went to the state seeking access to his original true biological records, he received a response that is shockingly common in the adoption community.
Yes, very common.
He was officially told that his vital original records were destroyed in a fire or flood.
And that response perfectly highlights the fault line we just discussed. I mean, the text points out the absurdity of a nation that possesses the sophisticated infrastructure to preserve its cultural memory, its national archives, its historical milestones, with meticulous temperature-controlled precision.
Right.
Yet, when it comes to the vital, foundational truths of individual citizens whose lives were shaped by its own institutions, it suddenly claims to be structurally incompetent.
Oops, we lost it in a flood.
Exactly. Boole argues that this discrepancy reveals the true nature of the system. He frames forced adoption not as a benevolent, localized child welfare initiative, but rather as a vast program of demographic extraction where the truth is intentionally obscured to protect the integrity of the state's actions.
Okay, so the biological identity is severed. The records are supposedly burned or flooded. What replaces it?
Well, the research dives deep into the reality of the substitute identity.
Right. Boole is placed into an adoptive environment, and the case study details a dynamic that is deeply complex and painful. He was placed with an adoptive mother, Pauline, who had previously, tragically, lost a child of her own to forced adoption.
Right, and this historical detail introduces a highly specific psychological concept from the research known as the placeholder child or the living proxy.
The living proxy?
Yeah. In this specific familial dynamic, the research suggests that Boole's presence in the home was not established on the foundation of his own inherent sovereign identity. He was not brought in to simply be himself.
Right.
Rather, he functioned as a systemic mechanism, a tool used to manage and suppress his adoptive mother's profound, unresolved trauma from her prior loss.
I'm trying to imagine the sheer invisible weight of that.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
you are an infant, and your fundamental role in the family structure is to serve as the therapeutic intervention for an adult's unmourned grief.
It's an impossible burden.
You aren't a blank slate. You are a replacement. And the fragility of that engineered belonging shattered incredibly quickly. Just 18 months after he was adopted into this household, his adoptive parents conceived and gave birth to twin biological daughters.
According to the case study, the arrival of biological children instantly cemented his status as a permanent outsider within his own legally mandated family.
Wow.
The text describes an environment increasingly defined by extreme isolation and coercive control. For example, shortly after Brule turned 21, the adoptive mother systematically severed ties with all extended family members on both sides.
Just cut everyone off.
Exactly. This action effectively removed any broader familial safety net, isolating him entirely within a highly controlled microenvironment.
But the detail in this section of the research that absolutely stopped me in my tracks involves what the legal system permitted when he was a teenager. The research details how a 16-year-old Bull was coerced into signing a legal no-contact veto against his biological mother.
This is a critical juncture in Boole's analysis of state legislation. It demonstrates how the system's architecture empowers the adoptive parent.
Right.
The legal apparatus allowed an adult to utilize the power of the state to manipulate a minor into legally barring his own biological mother from ever attempting to locate him.
Wait, I have to stop and really think about the sheer absurdity of the legal logic here. A 16-year-old is legally considered a minor, right?
Yes, of course.
A minor cannot sign a lease for an apartment. They cannot walk into a bank and sign a contract for a credit card because the state has determined their brain is not developed enough to understand the long-term consequences of a financial agreement.
That's the standard, yes.
But that exact same state allows that exact same 16-year-old to sign a legally binding document that permanently severs the fundamental biological ties of their existence.
It's a massive contradiction.
It's like the state is enforcing a legalized fiction, treating adoption not as a human relationship, but as a rigid property contract, where the minor's rights are entirely subordinate to the adoptive parent's desire for control.
That is precisely the conclusion Boole draws. He argues that this mechanism reveals the state views the adopted child less as a sovereign individual with inherent human rights and more as a transferred asset in a guardianship arrangement.
A transferred asset? That's bleak.
The substitute parent's need for absolute, unchallenged control supersedes the child's right to their own lineage. The text does note, however, that Boole eventually rescinded this veto years later, in 2001, following the birth of his own son.
Oh, okay.
He describes the act of tearing up that veto as his first major step in reclaiming his sovereign right to his own origins.
But you can't suppress biology forever, you know? The tension of this legalized fiction eventually snaps. The research details a pivotal moment in April 2016 when Boole finally successfully reunited with his biological mother, Leslie Mitchell.
Yeah.
In a normal context, you would hope this is a moment of profound expansion, a healing of a lifelong wound. Instead, the case study details a catastrophic family breakdown.
The reunion was catastrophic because it fundamentally threatened the implicit contract of the adoptive environment. In this specific setting, belonging was entirely conditional upon absolute loyalty to the substitute identity.
So acknowledging his real mother was?
It was viewed as an act of betrayal. The adoptive family presented him with a devastating ultimatum. He had to choose between the family that raised him and the biological mother he had just found.
And he chose reality. He chose his biological mother in order to establish personal safety and escape what the text describes as a long history of coercive control.
Right.
But the fallout from that choice was total and devastating. It resulted in permanent estrangement from his adoptive family. It triggered a double exile. The text outlines how he suffered from severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD.
It was severe enough that his psychological state deteriorated to the point where he eventually had to relocate overseas to Indonesia just to find a geographic sense of safety and distance from the trauma.
And that relocation triggered another layer of systemic failure. Because he moved overseas to manage his CPTSD, it resulted in the suspension of his National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS, support back here in Australia.
Exactly.
So the very state that authored the policy that initiated his trauma and legally mandated his placement in that environment then strips away the medical safety net he requires to survive the psychological fallout of that exact trauma.
It is a brutal cycle of administrative violence.
It really is.
Yeah.
But here is where the research takes a massive leap. The emotional and psychological toll we just discussed is obviously catastrophic. But Gould argues that we fundamentally misunderstand the depth of the damage if we only look at it through the lens of standard psychology.
Right.
He suggests that this specific kind of early life trauma doesn't just make you sad or anxious. It actually literally rewrites the physical wiring of the human brain.
This brings us to what is undeniably the most revolutionary and perhaps the most complex theoretical framework in Boole's entire body of work, the neurophenomenology of displaced lineage.
Okay, neurophenomenology. That is a massive, intimidating word.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
If I'm listening to this while driving or cooking dinner, my brain might just bounce right off that term. So let's ground it.
It is a dense term, but it is incredibly precise in its meaning.
Yeah.
Let's split it in half. Neuro refers to the physical biological brain. The neurons, the synapses, the actual gray matter inside your skull.
Okay, the hardware.
Exactly, the hardware. Yeah. And phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that studies subjective experience. It explores how things actually feel to you from a first-person perspective, how you perceive reality.
Right.
So neurophenomenology is the study of how physical changes in the structure of the brain directly create highly specific, subjective, emotional, and perceptual experiences. He is bridging the gap between objective biology and subjective feeling.
And the research argues that standard textbook psychiatry completely fails the adoptee community because it ignores this bridge.
He ignores it.
It pathologizes their distress. A traditional psychiatrist might look at an adoptee struggling with their identity and diagnose them with a mere adjustment disorder, essentially telling them, you are in a new situation, you just need to adjust and get used to it.
Right, which minimizes the reality.
Boole rejects that premise entirely. He introduces a concept he calls adoption qualia.
So qualia is another philosophical term. It describes the irreducible, raw, subjective feeling of a specific experience. The classic philosophical example is trying to explain the redness of a red apple.
Okay.
You can explain the physics of light wavelengths to someone. You can explain the optic nerve, but you cannot adequately explain the actual internal experience of seeing the color red to someone who has never seen it.
That feeling is qualia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Boole argues that there is a distinct adoption qualia, a highly specific subjective architecture of human consciousness that is entirely generated by the unnatural state-mandated severing of biological continuity.
And he doesn't just leave it as a philosophical concept. He bridges that subjective feeling of adoption qualia directly to objective biological mechanics using a methodology he calls sovereign inquiry.
Let's actually walk through the biology he outlines because it is staggering.
Let's do it.
It all starts at the genetic level, specifically with something called the epigenetic hypomethylation of the FKBP5 gene.
Okay, let's trace the mechanics of this step by step. Epigenetics is the scientific study of how your behaviors, and critically your early environment, can cause physical changes that affect the way your genes work, right? You have a gene called the FKBP5 gene. Its primary job is to help regulate your body's stress response. You can think of it as a chemical handbrake on your nervous system.
Okay, so I have a chemical handbrake. Now, if I experience severe early life trauma, such as being a newborn infant, fundamentally severed from the biological mother whose heartbeat I listened to for 9 months, the research claims this massive stress event causes the hypomethylation of that gene. To use our analogy, the trauma reaches deep into my DNA and completely snaps the chemical handbrake off.
Precisely. The handbrake is gone. Without it, the body's stress response system loses its ability to regulate itself.
It just redlines.
Exactly. The brain doesn't just experience stress, it becomes perpetually flooded, absolutely saturated over years and decades in chronic cortisol, which is the body's primary stress hormone.
Okay, so my brain is just marinating in cortisol 247. What does that actually physically do to the brain over a lifetime? Because the research states that over time, this chronic cortisol overload travels to the occipital lobe at the very back of the brain.
The visual center.
Right. And it begins to physically disrupt and damage what are called GABAergic interneurons.
GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. Its job is to slow things down, to filter out noise, to keep the brain calm.
Like the neural brakes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
GABAergic interneurons are essentially the vital neural brakes that specifically regulate sensory input. They decide what visual or auditory information is important and what can be ignored. When these interneurons in the visual cortex are continuously degraded by a lifetime of chronic cortisol exposure, The brain literally loses its structural ability to properly filter and regulate what it sees and feels in the physical environment.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm understanding the scale of this claim. Are we saying that the emotional, psychological pain of not knowing your bloodline, the grief of erasure, literally changes how bright a room looks to your eyes?
Yes.
That an emotional trauma physically manifests as an optical illusion?
According to this neurophenomenological framework, absolutely yes. The emotional trauma fundamentally and physically alters how the adoptee's brain processes light, space, and the geometry of their environment.
That's incredible.
Because the neural breaks in the visual cortex are damaged by the constant wash of stress hormones, an emotional trigger doesn't just make you feel sad, it literally alters your visual perception of reality.
To explain how this happens, Bilde draws heavily on the work of Dr. Richard E. Cytowic, who was a pioneer in the study of synesthesia.
Synesthesia, right.
Yeah, that fascinating neurological condition where people's senses cross over. They might literally taste the color blue or hear a specific sound when they see a triangle.
Okay, yeah.
Bolil maps this concept onto the adoptee experience. He theorizes that the complete unnatural absence of early lineage anchors leads to a specific neurological condition he coined acquired ideesthesia.
Acquired ideesthesia is defined as a cross-modal perceptual blending. But instead of tasting a color, it is a blending where severe relational uncertainty, the deep anxiety of not knowing who you are, translates into literal physical shifts in perception.
Right.
The idea or the emotional distress synthesizes directly with the visual senses.
The research details specific phenomenological states to make this real for us. The first one he defines is called emotional photism.
And the way he describes this is haunting.
It is. This is where emotional distress manifests physically as a shift in environmental luminance. So let's say you are an adoptee. You walk into a crowded room, maybe a holiday party. Suddenly, the overwhelming realization hits you that you have absolutely no biological relatives in this room, and perhaps none in the entire city.
The stress of that realization causes a massive cortisol spike.
And because of that biological damage, we discussed the degraded GABAergic inner neurons. The brain cannot regulate that emotional spike. The emotional pain is processed by the visual cortex as visual hostility or environmental darkening.
So the room literally looks darker to them.
The room literally appears to grow darker. The contrast shifts. The depth perception feels menacing. This is a critical distinction in the research because it argues the trauma is physiologically embedded.
It's hardware, not just software.
Exactly. It is altering the signal-to-noise ratio within the visual cortex. It is not a cognitive distortion where the person's just imagining things are bad. It is a measurable neurological event. Their eyes are reporting a hostile environment.
Then there is a second state he outlines called spatial liminality. This involves the hyperacute, subconscious, nonstop calculation of room geometry, the location of exits, and the shifting social dynamics of everyone in the space.
The framework views this as a brilliant but exhausting compensatory survival mechanism. Think about how most people navigate the world. We rely on lineage anchoring. We see biological mirrors of ourselves and our parents, our siblings, our extended family.
Right, there's a baseline there.
That mirroring provides a baseline subconscious sense of biological safety. Because the adoptee lacks those biological mirrors, their brain compensates by becoming hypervigilant regarding physical spaces.
I see.
The individual feels too present, perpetually calculating threat levels and exit routes, because that foundational baseline of biological safety was never installed.
And the third state is what he terms the liminal multiverse. This describes the overarching ontological state that adoptees inhabit. It is characterized by this deeply paradoxical, felt sense of belonging everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. You are detached from your origin, attached to a fiction, and floating in between. The text notes this leads to chronic relational exhaustion and a profound inability to form standard, relaxed attachments.
What is truly fascinating about Bull's approach here is how he operationalizes all this heavy theory. He doesn't just present a grim biological diagnosis and walk away.
Right, he does something with it.
He uses this data to establish what he calls the Cytowic-inspired framework for displaced lineage, or the Cytowic protocol. This is an entirely new clinical roadmap, and his primary goal is to shift the entire medical conversation away from a deficit-based model of psychiatric illness.
Right, the goal of the protocol isn't to ask, what is broken in your brain. It is about functional adaptation.
Exactly.
It validates these intense sensory and neural divergences not as a disease to be cured, but as the brain's incredibly logical, brilliant design response to an entirely unnatural separation. It provides a roadmap for somatic healing the body and the nervous system, rather than just throwing antidepressants at a patient and telling them they have an adjustment disorder.
So, if we follow the logical progression of this argument, if we accept the premise heavily documented in this research that the trauma of forced adoption literally changes human brain geometry, alters visual perception, and creates complex, lifelong psychosocial disabilities, you would naturally assume something about our society.
You'd assume we're prepared for it.
You would assume that the massive national health care and social work systems are rigorously, mandatorily trained to handle this exact neurology.
If my brain is physically rewired and my visual field is shifting, my first instinct is to go get professional help. I'm going to go to an early childhood educator, an aged care nurse, community social worker, and I'm going to assume they have been deeply educated on the biology we just spent 20 minutes discussing.
You would assume that. But when Shane Boole actually forensically audited the curriculum that trains those exact workers, the reality he uncovered was the exact catastrophic opposite.
This is wild.
And this brings us to the next massive pillar of his investigation. If the educational system is designed to prepare a workforce to care for the most vulnerable people in society, his findings suggest that system is operating in a state of deliberate negligence.
To understand how he uncovered this, we have to look at Boole's professional background. He is not just an advocate operating from personal lived experience. He isn't just an outsider writing letters.
Right, he's an insider.
The text highlights his over 25 years of high-level, specialized expertise as a senior vocational educator. He is a curriculum specialist, a creative partner with major corporate entities, and an e-learning administrator. He knows exactly how adult education is built, funded, and deployed from the inside out.
Utilizing that expertise, he conducted an exhaustive forensic audit of the National Register of Training Packages within Australia's Vocational Education and Training System, the VEP system.
Right.
This is the system responsible for certifying millions of workers. And what his audit discovered is what he terms an engineered policy vacuum.
He lays out a specific empirical data point from this audit that he calls the Greyhound paradox. And when I read this in the source material, I genuinely had to read it 3 times to ensure I wasn't misunderstanding it. It is staggering.
The Greyhound paradox is the empirical cornerstone of his argument regarding educational erasure. Within the entire vast Australian VET curriculum, the nationwide system that trains all of our human healthcare, aged care, and community service workers, Boole found that the only explicit mandated educational competencies for dealing with adoption and rehoming trauma are located within the Certificate 4 in Greyhound racing industry.
Let's really pause and let that reality sink in for a moment.
It's hard to believe.
The National Educational Standards of Australia comprehensively mandate that if you want to be certified to handle retired racing dogs, you must be trained in trauma-informed care. The curriculum explicitly acknowledges that a greyhound, separated from its pack and its original environment, suffers psychological distress and requires a worker with specialized understanding to care for it safely. Yet, for human beings, for children separated from their mothers, for adults living with the fractured neurology of forced adoption, there is an absolute, complete absence of mandated curriculum.
It is a devastating comparison. The research analyzes this not merely as a bureaucratic oversight or a delay in updating textbooks, but as an active form of cultural violence and structural erasure.
It's structural.
Think about the real-world implications.
Yeah.
Human care workers, people studying to get a diploma in early childhood education or community services or individual support, or aged care, they are graduating, getting their certificates, and entering the frontline workforce completely, as Boole terms it, adoption illiterate.
I thought of an analogy when reading this section. It is like a government spending billions to build a massive state-of-the-art trauma hospital and then actively refusing to mandate that the doctors inside it know how to perform CPR.
That's exactly it.
Because when frontline workers lack trauma-informed training specific to identity loss, genealogical erasure, and conditions like CPTSD stemming from forced adoption, they aren't just unhelpful to the survivor, they are actively dangerous.
Because the survivor is continually at risk of severe re-traumatization every time they attempt to access basic services, whether they were seeking health care, applying for NDIS disability support, or entering an aged care facility.
Right.
Imagine walking into a clinical therapy session, carrying the complex, neurologically altering trauma. We discussed the emotional photism, the hypervigilance, only to discover that the professional sitting across from you, who is legally sanctioned and paid by the state to help you, has less mandated government training on the specific nature of your trauma than a licensed dog handler.
It is infuriating, and the systemic omission doesn't exist in a vacuum. The research intersects this specific lack of training with a massive, broader context discussed in the text, the VETAELP integrity crisis.
Oh, right.
For listeners who might not remember the details of that, this was one of the largest regulatory and financial failures in Australian educational history.
The VETFE scandal involved systemic maladministration and aggressive predatory enrollments by private training providers.
Yeah.
The result, as highlighted in Beale's research, was the issuance of over 30,000 fraudulent or heavily compromised qualifications, specifically in the VET-NDI sector.
So, if we synthesize these two data points according to the research, the state essentially flooded the human services sector with tens of thousands of fundamentally underqualified personnel carrying compromised degrees, while simultaneously refusing to mandate the curriculum content necessary to protect the victims of the state's own historical forced adoption policies.
It's a perfect storm.
Vulnerable trauma survivors, people who had their identities erased by the state, are now being treated by an adoption-illiterate workforce carrying fake qualifications funded by the state.
Faced with this overwhelming empirical reality and armed with his own curriculum expertise, Brule didn't just write a paper about it. He initiated a relentless, highly documented advocacy campaign beginning in late 2022.
He went to work.
He directed this campaign at the highest levels of power: state and federal ministers, the Australian Skills Quality Authority, or ASQI, and the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, or DEWR.
The research meticulously details his correspondence. He wasn't yelling into the void, he was writing targeted expert briefs. He wrote to the Director General of the Department of Child Safety, Deidre Mulkerin. He wrote to the Federal Minister for Education, Jason Clare, and the Minister for Social Services, Bill Shorten.
He was trying to get through to the top.
He outlined the precise, undeniable intersections between forced adoption, coercive control, and the desperate, immediate necessity for educational reform in the VET sector.
His demands to DEWR, which were officially documented under specific departmental case numbers, were structurally very straightforward and actionable. He demanded three things.
Okay, what were they?
First, incorporate specific adoption-related topics into the mandatory core units of Human Services VET courses.
Makes sense.
Second, adopt trauma-informed terminology across the sector to dismantle societal gaslighting, for example, shifting language to refer to people living in an adoption situation rather than just adoptees, which acknowledges the ongoing structural reality.
I like that phrasing.
And third, formally recognize that the educational system has a strict legal duty of care to address psychosocial disabilities stemming from state-sanctioned family separation.
These are not wild, esoteric demands.
Yeah.
He is essentially asking the human services sector to catch up to the Greyhound sector.
Right.
But despite presenting these detailed, ready-to-implement frameworks to Jobs and Skills Australia and Human Ability, which is the specific Jobs and Skills Council funded by DDWR that is responsible for developing the Health and Human Services curriculum, the research states his expertise was actively and aggressively sidelined.
The documentation shows he engaged directly with top executives at Human Ability, including the CEO, Kylie Wolcock, and the engagement director, Janie Courtney. He participated in their process.
All of the rules.
But according to the case study, the result of this engagement was profound statistical erasure. The resulting 2025 workforce report, published by Human Ability, entirely erased forced adoption survivors from its data, solidifying their invisibility in national workforce planning.
And the personal cost to Bull for pushing this issue was devastating. The text states that as a direct consequence of his refusal to simply separate truth from professionalism, his refusal to stay quiet and accept this dangerous policy vacuum, his entire 20-year career in vocational education was systematically dismantled.
Yeah,
He faced severe professional displacement and ultimate financial ruin simply for demanding that care workers be trained to care.
And this professional destruction raises a profound question about how our society functions. When a recognized expert presents the government with a glaring, dangerous, empirically proven gap in public safety, you would naturally expect a swift correction, or at the very least, a formal, transparent investigation.
You would hope.
Instead, the research suggests Bull was met with a deeply entrenched, highly sophisticated defensive mechanism designed to neutralize him.
Which brings us to what is easily the most frustrating, Kafkaesque head against the wall part of this entire deep dive. Boole characterizes the government's response to his advocacy not as a serious dialogue, but as a highly evolved theater of absurdity. He literally likens the experience to being trapped inside a Monty Python skit.
The sociological concept he introduces to analyze this behavior is called installational corruption.
Okay, installational corruption.
And this is a vital distinction. When we hear the word corruption, we usually picture a room full of cartoon villains rubbing their hands together, intentionally plotting to hurt people for money.
Right, like bribery.
Installational corruption is different. It is a structural methodology of evasion. It is a bureaucracy functioning exactly as it was designed to function, to absorb external shocks, deflect criticism, and neutralize lived experience advocacy, thereby ensuring that the institutional hegemony and the status quo are protected at all costs.
The research methodically breaks down this circular discourse into 4 main tactics. He describes it operating like a weaponized customer service phone tree. I want us to walk through these 4 tactics because I guarantee every single person listening to this has experienced a mild version of this when trying to cancel a gym membership or dispute a phone bill.
Oh, absolutely.
But here, these tactics are being deployed against citizens fighting for fundamental human rights. So tactic number 1, jurisdictional ping pong.
This is the classic practice of a department acknowledging an issue exists, but claiming it strictly falls outside their specific legislative remit, and then directing the inquiry to a different, equally powerless body.
Oh, the runaround.
This creates an unbreakable, infinite loop. For example, the text notes the Australian Human Rights Commission claiming that adult identity rights fall outside the scope of the Children's Commissioner. Or ACE-QAR, stating that while they regulate the training providers, they don't actually develop the training packages, so they defer the complaint to DWR.
Right.
Then DWR deflects the responsibility for the curriculum content to Human Ability. Human Ability, in turn, claims it cannot act because it is waiting on overarching guidelines from Jobs and Skills Australia.
Everyone politely points the finger at the person standing next to them, and the victim is forced to run in circles until they run out of money or energy. Tactic 2 is what he calls bureaucratic absorption, or death by committee.
This tactic involves the illusion of action. It is the scheduling of endless meetings, the launching of public consultations, and the creation of working groups specifically designed to check the box for stakeholder engagement without ever intending to implement changes.
Oh, I've seen that.
It generates a massive amount of paperwork to simulate progress. The documented example in the text is Human Ability actively encouraging Boole to submit his detailed frameworks, inviting him to attend workshops, only to entirely exclude forced adoption survivors from the finalized DEWR-approved report. The system absorbs the kinetic energy of the advocate without producing any structural change.
Tactic 3 is incredibly insidious, and it is called administrative gaslighting. This is where a government department formally insists that evidence does not exist when it clearly does, or they rigidly enforce standard operating procedures that are physically, geographically, or psychologically impossible for the complainant to meet, thereby forcing the complainant to abandon the issue.
And we will see a staggering textbook example of this administrative gaslighting in just a moment with the Ombudsman case.
Exactly. And the final tactic is what he calls the argument clinic, or dead parrot denial, a direct nod to Monty Python. This is a flat, unyielding refusal to acknowledge a self-evident failure, continuously contradicting the complainant using circular, nonsensical logic.
The research points to government departments repeatedly pointing to the existence of the National Children's Commissioner as absolute proof that the issue of family separation is being handled, while completely ignoring the self-evident biological fact that the commissioner's mandate legally expires the second the victim turns 18 years old.
We have all been stuck in those awful customer service loops. You press 1 for billing, you press 2 for support, the line goes dead, and you have to start over. It is maddening.
It is.
But imagine that loop isn't about a $50 overcharge on a toaster. Imagine that loop is about your fundamental human rights, your biological identity, and the fraudulent education of the people treating your trauma. The text highlights a climax to this absurdity that occurred in April 2026. This is the Ombudsman and Lonergan research incident. Let's really look at this because it is unbelievable.
After years of battling DDER and Human Ability over these dangerous curriculum omissions, Boole followed the proper administrative procedure and escalated the matter to the Commonwealth Ombudsman, filing it under Case 2025-82011. He provided them with detailed, expansive reports demonstrating clear maladministration across the sector.
And the stated official response from the Ombudsman's office was to temporarily close the case, their justification. They claimed that Boole had not exhausted all the internal DWR complaint pathways.
Granted, yes.
They claimed this while blatantly ignoring his years of documented interaction with DWR and actively ignoring the explicit DWR case numbers he had provided in his submission. As you said earlier, it is textbook administrative gaslighting.
But the procedural violence goes even further. Boole, as we established earlier, was residing overseas to manage his trauma. He suffers from the debilitating functional barriers of CPTSD.
Right.
He explicitly requested a trauma-informed video call via Zoom or WhatsApp to safely and clearly resolve the matter with a human being. He explained in his request that the neurological freeze associated with this CPTSD made navigating their rigid, complex bureaucratic web forms exceptionally difficult and triggering.
So let's paint the picture. A trauma survivor driven overseas by state policy is literally begging for a human conversation, just a face on a screen, because the sterile forms are triggering a neurological freeze response. And how does the system respond?
It's hard to believe.
Instead of granting a WhatsApp call to address the massive national crisis of fraudulent qualifications in the disability sector, the system redirected him to a third-party market research firm called Lonergan Research. And why did they connect him to a market research firm? To ask him to complete a customer satisfaction survey about his recent experience with the Ombudsman's office.
It is the absolute peak of bureaucratic absurdity. When Boole actually got on the phone with a Lonergan representative, a man named Phil Burnham, Boole explicitly stated his situation. He explained he was not looking for a polite bureaucratic deflection or a survey. He desperately needed the Ombudsman to fulfill its statutory obligations and investigate the curriculum failure.
And the market surveyor's response to this plea. He told Boole that he couldn't help him with his actual complaint, and he instructed Boole to call the exact 1300 domestic phone number that Boole had repeatedly explicitly explained he could not access from overseas.
As the research eloquently argues, this Kafkaesque loop does something very specific. It actively strips the complaint of its moral weight.
It turns it into a metric.
It takes a profound human rights violation and shrinks it down into a customer service metric. It inflicts ongoing, grinding procedural violence on a trauma survivor, but it does so under the sterile, polite, legally protected guise of quality assurance and customer service.
And what's crucial to understand is that it is not just the faceless, nameless bureaucracy that engages in this deflection. The research notes that citizens hit political limits even when they are dealing with individuals who express genuine sympathy.
Yes, the politicians.
The text details how Boole engaged with Robert Tickner, a prominent former politician and well-known advocate. Boole was asking for a simple letter of support to help include forced adoption trauma under the Disability Discrimination Act.
The documented response from Tickner is revealing. It is described as being profoundly sympathetic. Tickner acknowledged the intensity of the anguish and the trauma he had personally witnessed in the adoption community over his career. He saw the pain.
So he acknowledged it.
However, despite that sympathy, he ultimately deflected the request. He cited his full-time volunteer commitments with another cause, the Justice Reform Initiative, and questioned if the Disability Discrimination Act was the correct legislative vehicle for the issue.
Which perfectly illustrates a core, frustrating political reality for adoptees outlined in the text. Their issues are consistently viewed by the political class as secondary. They are seen as too complex or too deeply entrenched in family law to be cleanly integrated into broader, more popular human rights campaigns.
They get pushed to the side.
Adoptees are offered endless wells of sympathy, but they are consistently denied structural legislative action.
So you reach a breaking point. If the educational system erases you from its data and the bureaucracy traps you in an endless, absurd loop of customer service surveys, and the politicians offer sympathy but no action, where do you turn?
Right. What's left?
The research suggests you have to stop fighting the symptoms and look at the very architecture of the laws themselves.
To understand the legal architecture, let's jump back to that 2013 national apology we discussed at the very beginning. The research notes a fascinating historical detail about the drafting of that apology. It highlights how former family court judge Nohu Mushin fought bitterly behind the scenes to include the specific word illegal in the text of the apology.
Yes.
He argued that without explicitly naming the forced separations as illegal acts, there could be no clear legal line drawn to state responsibility and compensation.
He was right to fight for it, but ultimately, the word was omitted. And 13 years later, Boole's research argues that the apology, without that legal teeth, has ultimately functioned as a public relations endpoint rather than a catalyst for genuine structural reform. The legislative architecture protecting adoptees remains fundamentally, intentionally fragmented.
The text outlines a massive, gaping hole in federal oversight. Currently, Australia has a National Children's Commissioner, but as we touched on earlier, their mandate strictly covers individuals from age 0 to 18. The second you blow out the candles on your 18th birthday, federal oversight over your identity rights simply vanishes into thin air.
And alongside the Children's Commissioner, there is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. This office provides absolutely vital, essential mechanisms for stolen generation survivors, focusing exclusively on Indigenous populations.
But if you look at those two offices, you immediately see the void. Adult non-Indigenous adoptees, adult survivors of the out-of-home care system, adult kinship care survivors, they fall completely outside both mandates.
They're just gone.
They are entirely abandoned by federal human rights monitoring. They have nowhere to go.
To bridge this massive jurisdictional gap, Boole proposed a structural solution. He formally proposed the creation of a new, specific office, a National Social Justice Commissioner for Family Separation and Reconnection.
And the stated response from the federal government to this proposal. The text documents that in March 2026, the Attorney General's Department, operating under Minister Tanya Plibersek, issued what Boole describes as a classic textbook bureaucratic deflection.
The moral shield.
Exactly. They use the existence of the current commissioners as a moral shield. The department argued that existing work already covered the issue, actively and knowingly ignoring the self-evident fact that adult non-Indigenous survivors are explicitly, legally excluded from those existing mandates. It's the argument clinic tactic in full effect.
Because the overarching federal system refuses to adapt, the research lays out three highly specific, restorative legal demands. These are concrete, actionable policy changes designed to dismantle the architecture of erasure from the ground up.
Let's go through them. First, the unconditional release of original unamended birth certificates. Boole characterizes the current standard practice as nothing less than the legal falsification of vital records by the state.
Falsification.
He argues a very simple point of logic. If a legal document must be issued to establish guardianship for an adopted child, it should be accurately titled a certificate of adoption. It should not be titled a birth certificate that literally rewrites biological history.
The second demand is for no-fault adoption discharges. Currently, for an adult adoptee to legally sever ties with their adoptive parents, they often have to go through a harrowing legal process of proving severe abuse or dysfunction in court.
Which is traumatizing.
Boole proposes the establishment of a standardized administrative legal pathway for adult adoptees to unilaterally vacate an adoption decree. It would function similarly to a no-fault divorce. It would allow an adult to easily, legally restore their original legal identity without the traumatizing, expensive burden of proving abuse to a judge.
And the third demand ties back to our discussion of the brain. Formal recognition under the Disability Discrimination Act, the DDA, that the enduring effects of forced adoption trauma, the neurophenomenology we discussed, constitute a recognized form of psychosocial disability.
This isn't about getting a label. It is about leverage.
Right, because if it is recognized under the DDA, it forces systemic legal compliance across the entire VET educational sector. They would be legally forced to teach it.
But, as we have spent the last hour exploring, the traditional institutional channels have repeatedly, aggressively failed to enact these demands. The doors are closed. And this is where the research takes a fascinating, unexpected turn into technological resistance. Because the thesis here is simple. When human institutions fail to protect your humanity, you have to build your own tools.
And Boole had the exact skill set to do this. He transitioned his decades of expertise in digital production and e-learning into what he beautifully calls digital mysticism. He began developing custom digital tools to bypass the institutional opacity that was blocking him.
One of the primary tools he developed is called the Sovereign Identity Codex. This is not just a software program. It is a complex, super prompt AI architecture that acts as a cognitive exoskeleton for trauma survivors.
I love that term, cognitive exoskeleton.
That's great, isn't it? We discussed how CPTSD causes neurological freeze when facing bureaucratic forms. The Codex is designed to help displaced individuals bypass the state's confusing, sterile administrative language.
So it translates for them.
Exactly. It takes their raw, personal trauma and translates it into highly structured, evidence-based, emotionally regulated forensic briefs that the government cannot easily dismiss. It moves the survivor from what psychology calls a socialized mind, one that is desperately seeking validation from the state, into a powerful state of self-authoring.
A cognitive exoskeleton for fighting bureaucracy. He also developed something called the Adoptee Justice AI, or Bridgewalker Chat. This is an AI model specifically trained to spot institutional bias in government documents.
Yeah, this is brilliant.
It analyzes massive amounts of documentation looking for forensic abnormalities and the use of passive voice. For example, if a state document says the child was removed, the AI highlights that this passive voice intentionally masks who did the removing. It flags it and demands the active truth. We, the state, removed the child.
He is also pushing the boundaries into blockchain identity archives. This involves utilizing immutable, decentralized ledger technology. The goal is to create a space where adoptees can upload and permanently secure unalterable proof of their original biological identity and DNA connections.
Oh, that's smart.
It creates a permanent digital record that exists outside of government servers, a record that the state can never again conveniently claim was destroyed in a fire or flood.
There is a profound, almost tragic philosophical irony in this section of the research. Think about what is happening here. An adoptee is turning to artificial intelligence, a system built of code, completely devoid of a beating heart, devoid of human emotion or empathy, to finally find the objective fairness, the logic, and the truth that human institutions refuse to provide.
The machine is more humane than the government department.
Exactly. It is simultaneously brilliant and deeply heartbreaking.
And he pairs this cutting-edge technological resistance with a profound literary resistance. He wrote and published a massive, multi-volume philosophical memoir called the Bridgewalker series.
And the structural execution of this memoir is brilliant. He didn't just write a chronological story. He released the books in reverse order. He published book 3 first, then book 2, and finally book 1.
Right.
When I first read that, I thought it was just a clever marketing gimmick. But it's not. It perfectly structurally mirrors the exact cognitive experience of being an adoptee. You wake up as an adult in the present day, book 3, living inside this fully constructed fictional identity. And you have to painstakingly, exhaustively reverse engineer your own existence, digging backward through time and lies to finally find the origin of the wound in book 1.
It is a remarkable synthesis of form and function. And it brings us to the culmination of our journey today. We have traveled from the extreme micro level of a single, altered human brain, exploring the neurophenomenology of displaced lineage, and how trauma darkens a room, all the way out to the vast macro level of national VET curricula, the Monty Python tactics of bureaucratic deflection, and the utilization of artificial intelligence as a tool for human resistance.
So we have all these massive threads: the biology, the education, the bureaucracy, the technology. Let's pull them together for the listener. What does Bull's research ultimately conclude that this all points to?
The ultimate conclusion of the research is a paradigm shift. Bull argues that the adoption industry, as constructed by the state, can no longer be viewed through the benevolent, soft-focused lens of humanitarian child welfare.
Right.
Rather, the entire architecture operates as a geoeconomics of adoption. It is a vast system of demographic extraction, where human capital children is legally laundered and redistributed to serve the psychological and social needs of substitute families sanctioned by the state. And the research identifies 3 unyielding pillars of failure that maintain this system today: the deliberate educational negligence in the VET sector, the weaponized institutional deflection operating as standard policy, and a deliberately fragmented human rights architecture that abandons the adult.
And as we wrap up this incredibly dense journey, a quick reminder to you, our listener. We have spent this time strictly unpacking the findings, the claims, the data, and the expansive worldview presented in Shane Bull's forensic research, alongside the documented public pushback from the state institutions.
Yes.
We've aimed to offer you a front-row seat to a deeply complex, ongoing battle over truth, biology, and governance, without endorsing the underlying political critiques as absolute truth.
It is a vital exploration of the ongoing tension between raw, lived human reality and the cold exercise of administrative power.
Which brings us right back to where we started this conversation. I want you to think about your own birth certificate sitting in a drawer somewhere. Think about your family photos, your medical history, your understanding of whose eyes you have. We all implicitly trust the state to be the ultimate benevolent record keeper of our reality.
We do.
But if the state possesses the legal power to falsify those vital records, to literally rewrite your lineage with whiteout, and then simply wait for you to tire out and give up in an endless, absurd bureaucratic maze of customer service surveys, where does your true identity actually live? Does your existence simply reside on a piece of government paper subject to alteration by a clerk? Or is your identity something entirely sovereign, encoded in your biology, your consciousness, and your memories, just waiting for you to reclaim it?
That is a profound question to carry forward into how we view the systems that govern us.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. It's a heavy journey, both intellectually and emotionally, but it is an absolutely vital one to understand how our world actually operates. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking for the truth, and we'll see you next time.